Hello and welcome to BizFirst Review 360. This week, the Prime Minister sought help from Japan to develop the Trincomalee port, and the government revived its efforts to attract investors for the debt-burdened Sri Lankan Airlines. Also this week, the government moved to clear the air on the controversial Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. Let's take a look at our top stories.
The Japanese Defense Minister Itsunori Onedera, who was on a two-day official tour of Sri Lanka, visited the Eastern Naval Command and toured the Chinese-funded Hambantota port. With the Trincomalee harbour poised to play a key role in the rapidly developing Bay of Bengal region, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has requested Japanese help to develop the Trincomalee harbour. Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has also stressed that Sri Lanka is committed to free maritime movement in the Indian Ocean. Analysts say the move is seen as an attempt by Sri Lanka to diversify foreign investment in critical infrastructure facilities with the aim of balancing geopolitical interests in Sri Lanka.
We can see recently the Japanese defense minister is touring this country, and there is this conversation that Japan will be also interested in taking up certain projects in Sri Lanka, especially in contested sensitive areas where there is Chinese and Indian presence. So there are worries among certain Sri Lankan analysts that this might aggravate the situation, this might create more tensions. It might create some tension, it might create some anxiety among the Chinese interests as well as Indian interests, but my argument is Sri Lanka should do this multi-level engagement, but not by succumbing to the demands, but by managing that. So Sri Lanka needs this multilateral, multi-layered engagement with many countries, especially the countries which are involved in this geopolitical contestation. But Sri Lanka has to be also be sensitive to the fact that any agreement, like a free trade agreement or any deal that we strike, should be in the best interest of the country, as well as there should be a levels of consultation and deliberation. What I think that Sri Lanka, the current government, I think should do, which I feel is that there should be more deliberation. Especially there is so much of conversations about the Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement. One major problem is that I don't know how many people actually saw it, how much of deliberation took place even within the state ranks. Because I feel if you are getting involved or into a free trade agreement or any other deal or any other agreement with another nation, there has to be consultations not just among the political executive, there has to be consultation among the bureaucrats and the academics, because there are certain academics who bring a lot of wealth of knowledge from their research, bureaucrats from their experience. Right? We have a fine Department of Commerce, but the problem is, are these people consulted? So if we do ad hoc agreements, ad hoc treaties without proper consultation, it will seriously compromise Sri Lanka's national security, our economic interests, and it will seriously challenge Sri Lanka's people's own sovereignty.
State Minister of National Policies and Economic Affairs Dr. Harsha De Silva said, although the President has appointed a committee to analyse the Singapore-Sri Lanka Free Trade Agreement, the FTA is already in effect, rejecting opposition claims that Sri Lanka will be used as a waste disposal ground. Minister De Silva stressed that the island was protected by international treaties and regulations to control cross-border movement of waste.
Singapore inna million 5. එතකොට මේක පාකිස්තාන් කිව්සුමේ තියෙන විදියටමයි, හින්දියන් කිව්සුමේ තියෙන විදියටමයි, ගැට් එකේ තියෙන විදියටමයි, MFN එකේ තියෙන විදියටමයි තියෙන්නේ. කිසිම විදියකට වෙනස් වෙලා නැහැ. එතකොට සිංගප්පූරුවේ මිලියන් 5 කුණු ලංකාවට ගේන්නේ theoretically කවදා හරි කියන්න පුළුවන්, ආයු ගන්න පුළුවන්, ගේන්න පුළුවන් කියලා. ගේන්න බෑ. එහෙමනම් ලංකාවේ ඉන්නවා මිනිස්සු මිලියන් 20ක්. ඒතර අපේ කුණු ඔක්කොම සිංගප්පූරුවට ඩියුටි ෆ්‍රී ගෙනියන්න පුළුවන් මේක යටතේ. ඒ කියන්නේ මීටට මුල්ලේ කුණු ටික කුණු නැව් ගෙනල්ලා ඒ කුණු නැව් වලට පටෝලා ඩියුටි ෆ්‍රී සිංගප්පූරුවට ගිහලා බානවා. එහෙම පුළුවන්ද කරන්න? දැන් සිංගප්පූරුව ඩියුටි ෆ්‍රී කුණු වලට. එහෙම සිංගප්පූරුව ඉඩ දෙනවද ගේන්න? ඒ වගේම තමයි අපි ඉඩ දෙන්නෙත් නෑ ගේන්න. දැන් අපි හිතමු මොකද්ද මේ කරලා තියෙන්නේ ඩියුටි ෆ්‍රී කියලානේ. දැන් ඩියුටි වලින් කන්ට්‍රෝල් කරන්න බෑ මේ වගේ දේවල්. කවදාකවත් ඩියුටි වලින් නෙමෙයි මේ වගේ මේ ඉම්පෝර්ට් එක්ස්පෝර්ට් කන්ට්‍රෝල් කරන්නේ. ඒවා ඉම්පෝර්ට් එක්ස්පෝර්ට් කන්ට්‍රෝල් කරන්නේ non tariff barriers වගේ. හරි? ඉතින් ඒ non tariff barriers ඒ කියන්නේ ඩියුටි නෙවෙයි වෙන අනිත් සම්බාධක මෙවයි තියෙනවා.
Media reports quoting a finance ministry official said that the government is to revive its search for a partner for state-run Sri Lankan Airlines within the next 3 months. According to media reports, expression of interest will be called under a new leadership aimed at cutting losses. Reports said the new board of the airline was confident of recording a lower loss at the end of the 2018-19 financial year compared to when it took office in April this year. The debt-ridden airline recorded an operational loss of 13.7 billion rupees in 2017 compared to the loss of 10.4 billion rupees in the previous year.
How can Sri Lanka make its huge public sector efficient and competitive? That's coming up after the break. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You are watching Biz First Review 360. Dr. Ganesh Vignaraja, the Executive Director of the Global Economic Program at the Lakshman Kadrigamar Institute, shared his thoughts with us on labour market reforms.
So there's a vicious cycle that's created. You have arts graduates, particularly in the really soft subjects coming out of the universities. They often cannot find jobs in the private sector because the skills that you need in the STEM subjects as well as in economics and business are lacking, and law. So they typically have to end up by going into low productivity public sector jobs. Those are attractive because they provide a pension and a stable income and a job for life, but you don't advance very far. So we create a kind of a frustration, while the private sector, which is essentially the driver of wealth and growth in any open economy, is starved of the graduates that it needs. So we have this huge mismatch, and by the way, all of this is being paid for out of the general government kitty. So I think we need to take a really hard look at this, because ultimately Sri Lanka's best resource are its people. And gosh, Sri Lankans seem to do very well abroad, and in the private sector we need to ensure that the public sector also comes up to these types of standards, so that we are doing a fair service to our youth in Sri Lanka. So the rural sector, broadly defined, is a key part of our economy still. Most of the population of the country lives in the rural sector. The urban areas in this country, Colombo and Greater Colombo, are large, but most of it is in the rural sector. We need to look at the productivity of people in that sector. So that's partly an issue of increasing the size of holding. We have lots of small holdings in Sri Lanka. They are very small and very uneconomical in some cases. We need to look at some kinds of consolidation, and some of that is happening anyway naturally, through the plantation sector and other areas. Second, we need to try to look at new technology and fertilizer as well as irrigation to the kinds of things that we might produce. It might be rice, it might be high yielding vegetables and fruits, both for the domestic market but also for export. Then we have to look at the transport linkages and refrigeration, which is critical. I understand there's a high proportion of products in the rural sector that go to waste because we don't have adequate refrigeration.
Especially fruits and vegetables.
That's right, for fruits and vegetable in particular. And then we have to try to ensure that a fair price is paid for those fruits and vegetables. So I think we have a number of things we need to consider. And in a country like ours, a high proportion of people will continue to work in the rural sector. For those who want to come to the urban sector, I think we need to provide a really good university education so that they can go out and get those private sector jobs in a competitive manner that will serve them, in a way that we are going to open up and globalize in the future. The public sector cannot provide all the jobs in this country. It's 17% of the workforce, and it's probably higher than that of equivalent countries. So we need to look at making a much leaner, meaner, fitter public sector for the future with competent people there. You need a public sector, they're very important, but we need to balance that with a really important and useful skill base of people going into the private sector, and that will be the engine of growth for the future of Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka has an entitlement culture which comes from a welfare state that we've enjoyed for 50 odd years, and that was fine in the early days in the 1950s. when Sri Lanka could actually afford a very good welfare state. We had surpluses from the plantations, we had fiscal surpluses rather than deficits, and we had a balance of payment surplus. The problem over the years is that we have twin deficits. We have a balance of payments deficit and we have a budget deficit. And now we have this phenomenon of debt. Sri Lanka's debt to GDP ratio is 77%, which is coming to unsustainable levels over time. We can manage it providing we take some steps of reform over time. But if we continue to increase the size of the public sector, increase the welfare spending that we might do, these deficits will become unsustainable eventually over time, and we may face a financial crisis. So I think it's important that we begin to take a long-term view of these types of issues, and the labour market, I feel, is the most important area we should look at, along with reforms to improve the flexibility of the economy so that we allow the private sector to thrive. And there are several steps that are important for the labour market. We have to increase the supply of women into the labour force, particularly amongst an ageing population. Second, we have to ensure that we deal with the skill mismatch coming out of universities, where we have lots of arts graduates who are probably not fitted to the needs of the private sector. We need to make sure that those arts graduates firstly consider the sorts of opportunities in the private sector and get internships, particularly in private firms. And university careers officers need to ensure that they can provide those types of placements. And then we have to increase the supply of English teachers and of English educated workers coming out of the universities so that we have a labour force for a global labour market. And with the port city, I mean, the big issue is, are we going to have the people to be able to staff the port city? I mean, we are talking about 300,000 people living and working in the port city. I'm not sure if we have that many graduates with English and other technical skills coming out of the university system. So that's a big problem for us. So what we need to try to do is to really take a hard look at the skill needs of the country in relation to its growth, and to try to look at what kind of human capital will be required for the next generation of industries as well as service sectors, particularly in Sri Lanka. And those would have to include information and communication technology, banking and finance, as well as a lot of leisure-oriented industries, including tourism. And so we need to make sure that the skill set that we get out of the universities will be there for those industries. That's not to say manufacturing isn't important. Textiles and garments will be with us for some time. We have got a very good competence there. We have very good competence in food processing. Those are more technical level skills that we're going to need, and we're also going to need lots of managerial skills. So in that sense, it's not that hard to understand, but we have to start making a start at some point. And the lobby groups and the entrenched groups are, because we have this welfare culture, people are entrenched and like doing things in a particular way. They see things as an important entitlement, and we need to start thinking about this, particularly in a scenario where we have this very high debt to GDP ratio of 77%. So policy uncertainty, sadly, is going to be a feature of coalition governments. You have one group of people who will say one thing and another group of people who might say another thing. On balance, the coalition, I think, has got some broad things right. They have a better macroeconomic framework than before. We have flexible inflation targeting for macroeconomic management. We have a reasonable exchange rate and monetary policy. We are beginning to do the structural reforms, particularly trade facilitation, I think is been very important. And we are taking some look at these projects that have low rates of return, such as the Hambantota port, and we're trying to restructure those properly. So there's a bunch of things that we've done. I think we have to start thinking about the next 10 years in terms of the agenda that we should be setting for the country, and tackling some of these issues like education, like public sector reform, like agriculture, which are going to be much more difficult. And with that, we've got to try to carry people across the political spectrum. We've got to have a national agenda that is bought in by all factions of the political grouping, and I think that is our real challenge. And so that would really require the think tanks in this country and the academics and others coming together and having a vigorous debate about what are the priorities, where this country should be in 10 years, how do we create the kinds of jobs we need for our youth, how do we deal with the debt issue, and how do we ensure that this remains a prosperous and well-founded and viable country in the future. And I think that's the big challenge for Sri Lanka.
Stay tuned. We will be right back after this short commercial break. Welcome back to BizFirst Review 360. Now a look at some cabinet decisions this week.
Cabinet nod has been granted to create activities in the fields of power, industries, garbage disposal and forests to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and secure scheduled grants to Sri Lanka for project implementation. The Cabinet decision said it is necessary to identify the amount of greenhouse gas emissions of sectors to reach the targets determined locally. The Cabinet of Ministers has approved a proposal by Minister of Finance and Mass Media Mangala Samaravira to study the feasibility of selling euro, yen and renminbi bonds to cut interest costs. Sri Lanka has only sold dollar-denominated sovereign bonds. Central Bank Governor Indrajit Kumaraswamy had earlier said that Sri Lanka wanted to sell a $250 million Panda renminbi bond later next year. On a proposal by the President, Maithripala Sirisena, the Cabinet of Ministers has approved recommendations to impose an injunction order preventing all constructions and filling up of wetlands in and around Colombo and designate them as protected areas. According to the Cabinet decision, the Director of Wildlife will be asked to name wetlands as protected regions except the land surrounding Devannaya and Kimbula Ala, which have already been identified for development.
That's all the news we have for you tonight. You can look us up on Facebook by simply typing BizFirst Review 360. Good night and take care.